The Abilene and Smoky Valley Railroad is located on 200 Southeast 5th Street in Abilene, Kansas. The Abilene and Smoky Valley Railroad offers public excursion train rides May through October. The Abilene and Smoky Valley Railroad is located just at the old Abilene town, south of the Dwight D. Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. The railroad line that it travels along is the former Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad line that used to run from Harrington, Kansas to Salina, Kansas. The railroad runs dinner trains once a month. The trains operate on approximately 5.5 miles of trackage between Abilene, Kansas and Enterprise, Kansas. And also, the locomotive hooks to the train for the return trip to Abilene from Enterprise as well. Also, the railroad even has a rail bus called the Silver Flyer Rail Bus, and it's scheduled to run on the line on days it's scheduled to run. So if you ever wonder when it will run, try checking the website. Also, the railroad excursion trains are also pulled by diesel and steam trains as well. Union Pacific 25466 was built in 1959 and was used behind in a CA7 class steel caboose. This caboose was one of the many steel Union Pacific cabooses used behind freight trains in the past on the Union Pacific line. Later on, Union Pacific was used as the train crew's office. Then later on, Union Pacific 25466 was then retired in May of 1989 and then donated to the Riley County Historical Museum in Manhattan, Kansas. Then in October that year was moved to the Abilene and Smoky Valley Railroad Association in Abilene, Kansas, and then restored in 1993 and also used for the Abilene and Smoky Valley Railroad train, and people even ride in it as well.
What you
see right behind me is Hutchison and Northern 4. Hutchison and Northern 4 was built by Alco in Schenectady, New York in 1945 and is the 733 53rd diesel locomotive built by that factory and is an Alco S1 type diesel locomotive. This locomotive was originally built for the South Omaha Terminal Railway as South Omaha Terminal Railway 1 and operated as if it was a shunter locomotive there. Then, in 1969, it was sold to the Hutchison and Northern Railroad as Hutchison and Northern 4 and was used as a shunter locomotive there and used in Hutchison, Kansas as well. Then later, the locomotive was sold to the Abilene and Smoky Valley Railroad and even operates whenever it's used for pulling the trains there as well. Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 3415 was built by Baldwin in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1919 and is the 51861st steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 462 Pacific type steam locomotive and is a 3400 class steam locomotive. Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 3415 hauled passenger trains on the Illinois and Missouri divisions of the Eastern lines, but also on all divisions on the Western lines and the Northern division of the Gulf line. Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 3415, along with other 3400s, were built with 73-inch drivers, but from 1935 to 1941, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe's Topeka shops rebuilt them as oil burners with 79-inch box pock drivers with new thicker main rods and Elsco feed water heaters. Also, Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 3415 was then retired in the 1950s and in 1955 was donated to Abilene, Kansas and sat next to the main line of the Abilene and Smoky Valley Railroad in Eisenhower Park, and also put on static display in 1996, and people even got to climb into the locomotive's cab. And then in 2005, the locomotive was moved from the park to the train shed for restoration. And then in 2009, Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 3415 went back to operation and still operates on the Abilene and Smoky Valley Railroad whenever it's scheduled to run. Also, Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 3415 is one of 6 remaining Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 462s left in the world today, and 3415 can be seen part of the Abilene and Smoky Valley Railroad, where it operates very often today. Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul 656 was built in 1947 and is a passenger coach. Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul 656 was once numbered as Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul 546, then later renumbered to 656. The coach was a leg rest coach rebuilt from a 52-seat coach, and also this car is painted in a Union Pacific scheme. Also, the car was used on passenger trains many years ago. Then Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul 656 was retired in 1971 and then sold to and used as Hardee's restaurant in Spirit Lake, Iowa, and then sold and moved to Troy, Kansas. Later, the coach was donated to the Abilene and Smoky Valley Railroad and used part of the dinner train whenever the dinner train runs. What you see right behind me is Chicago Northwestern 3464. Chicago Northwestern 3464 was built by the Pullman Company and is a passenger car. This coach was once used for the Chicago Northwestern Maintenance of Way as Chicago Northwestern Maintenance of Way 614 in Rockford, Iowa, and was also in Chicago Northwestern Maintenance of Way service, and then as Chicago Northwestern X301035. Also, this car was even used on passenger trains on the Chicago Northwestern Railroad as well. Then later on, Chicago Northwestern 3464 was retired and then came to be part of the Abilene and Smoky Valley Railroad in Abilene, Kansas. Then operated once again as part of the dinner train as well whenever the dinner train runs. The Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Depot was built in 1887 and was used for passenger service for the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad. Also, passengers would board a train or arrive on a train at this station and would even wait in the waiting room as it contained 3 rooms. The first from the west was a ladies' waiting room. The second middle room was the agent's office and ticket office, and the third room was the men's waiting room. This latter space was just recently converted to men's and women's restrooms at the east end of the building was a very large freight room that will be converted to a railroad museum. This depot was no longer being used by the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad and was moved to the south side of 5th Street to make it way for the Eisenhower Library and Museum. The outside of the building has received a new coat of paint to help preserve the building. The building still has the original woodwork, all the original woodwork and stained glass windows above the doors and windows, and it is also owned by the Abilene and Smoky Valley Railroad these days, and has a ticket office for passengers to buy a ticket and ride the train, and even has a gift shop as well. Well, hope you all enjoyed learning about train today. Matthew Left from you guys' segment show. Also, I hope to see you all again in the next segment. So this is Matthew Left. Matthew Left from you guys' segment show. Signing off. Till next time. All aboard.